So it's not like, well, I committed the sin of gluttony this one time. Nobody cares. What we care about is when that becomes a groove in your life, when that becomes a pathway to happiness, because then it's going to bear all kinds of other fruit in your life, all kinds of other symptoms that are going to be characteristic of you, because this is your character. This is your life now. This is who you're becoming.
What do ancient concepts of virtue and vice have to teach us about a meaningful life today? These timeless ideas don't just belong in history books, they are deeply relevant to how we shape our character, our relationships, and our faith.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're diving into on today's episode of the theFormed.life podcast. We're digging into this rich tradition of virtues and vices, exploring how they can guide us towards spiritual growth and deeper alignment with God's design for our lives.
I'm Bill Gorman, campus pastor at the Brookside campus.
And I'm Paul Brandis, campus pastor at the Shawnee campus. And today we're so excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Rebecca DeYoung, who brings profound insight into this topic. She's a professor of philosophy at Calvin College for over 20 years, specializing in ethics, virtue theory, and the 7 deadly sins, though she thinks maybe we shouldn't call them that. You'll hear more. Her notable works include the books Glittering Vices and Vainglory, and her research appears in leading academic journals.
Yeah, and in this conversation, we'll examine how vices like pride, envy, and sloth can hold us back, and how cultivating virtues like humility and courage and love can transform our hearts and our lives.
We're also going to explore practical ways to recognize the habits that shape us, intentionally pursue virtue, and reflect Christ more fully in our daily lives.
So whether you're looking to overcome destructive patterns or simply grow deeper in your walk with God, this episode will challenge and encourage you. So let's jump in right now. Well, Dr. DeYoung, thank you so much for being with us today on the theFormed.life podcast. It's just a delight to have you today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, well, I first encountered your work years ago when the first edition of Glittering Vices came out, and I actually remember where I was at in the bookstore and saw it. I had not heard of it before, but I was so intrigued by the title, picked it up and read it as a young pastor, and it was so helpful. And then I remember when your book Vainglory came out, how this the impact of a vice that I had not really thought about, certainly with that language that we don't talk a lot about in discourse. And so I've just been so impacted by your work, and I'm just really grateful for it. And I wonder if you, to begin our conversation, would just talk a little bit about how did you end up in this field of studying virtues and vices? How did you end up doing this work?
Well, I started out with virtues and then somehow migrated downward. It all degenerated from there. Actually, I think the story really begins with philosophy. I'm a philosopher by training, and philosophy begins with really common sense existential questions that everybody asks. What kind of person should I become? What kind of life am I living? Does my life have meaning and worth, and what would make it satisfying? And a lot of those questions lead you into character language, character questions, like how can I become a different kind of person? What kind of transformation processes are available to me? And does that take wisdom, and does that take virtue, and what would those be? And there's just not a lot of articulacy around virtue talk even today. So going back in the tradition a little bit, even all the way back to Socrates, he's trying to get definitions of virtues on the table, because he's like, you need to live into this stuff. You need to live a well-lived, wisdom-seeking life, but you don't even know what you're talking about when you say wisdom, or when you say justice, or when you say various forms of virtue. So I started as a philosopher, and I took a virtue ethics course, and I took a course in Aquinas on the virtues. And it was in the course of reading through, believe it or not, this huge section of the Summa Theologia, which is Aquinas. He's a 13th century medieval theologian. And so I'm reading through this like really dry, dusty stuff in grad school, and I ran across this vice called Pusillanimity. And it's such a mouthful. I can't even say it. People hate to ask me about it because they're like, then I have to say it in the question. Can you tell us about the story that opens your book? So this vice, Pusillanimity, is really a kind of version of imposter syndrome, like not believing that if you've actually been called to something, that God will equip you for every good work, and that you can have confidence that he'll make it fruitful. I was sitting there thinking, wow, I'm not sure I can make it in this profession. There's all these super smart people here, and they all seem so well read, because that's what academics do, right? They make you feel like they're the most well read person in the room. And so I was really intimidated, and I read the name of this vice, and it was like an epiphany. It was like a light bulb going on.
Wow.
And I thought, wait a minute, what is it about this tradition and its ability to name things that so illuminates my character and where I'm at and what I'm struggling with? And the great thing is that it didn't just offer a name for the struggle. It offered me a path out of the struggle, or a way forward, and a way toward healing and wholeness and flourishing. And I thought, I need to teach this stuff. This is life-changing. And sure enough, when I first taught it, Calvin University, my students had exactly the same reaction.
Wow.
And I was a little worried, because, you try to run people through a primary text like the Summa. It's not easy going.
No, yeah.
And their response to me was, on every page, I just feel like he's talking to me about my life and character. So yeah, it was life-changing. And they said, you should write this up into a book, because this is life-changing. And so I said, okay. And that's how you get the book.
Yeah. And so sort of as you were thinking about virtue, it was actually encountering the vices, having a name for some of the impediments to those virtues that kind of got you into looking at, okay, what are these various vices? How has the church kind of talked about that?
Yeah, I'm
right?
not the sort of person who walks around thinking, oh, yeah, that's a virtue I have. I mean, oh, maybe you guys are. I don't know. I think people are very, they can be very reserved about their flaws, but they're definitely aware of them, typically, even if they're not talking about them or advertising them. And so if you give people a diagnosis and a path toward rehabilitation, that's so liberating. It's a little bit like having symptoms and they're bothering you and you're struggling and they're interfering with daily life and you just don't know what to do about it. And finally you go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, this is what you have. We've got, oh, you should do this. This is the path toward healing and wholeness. And you're like, oh, thank goodness. I'm finally on the right track, instead of just sort of fumbling around with all the stuff that is causing me trouble.
Well, and so you're starting to answer a little bit of kind of where we were going to go next with the question, but we're a Protestant church and embedded in a Protestant, you're embedded at a Protestant university. And this language of like the 7 deadly sins or capital vices maybe sometimes makes us Protestants feel a little bit like, oh, I don't know, is that really like our thing? Or maybe a little bit nervous, but you're starting to answer a little bit of the potential power around still engaging, not maybe even just with those 7 vices, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that and how really, whether it's the capital vices or any other vice that you might come across that would illuminate the potential need to heal and pursue wholeness there. Yeah, just share a bit more about that and how that framework can fit well and deepen our understanding of spiritual growth and formation. I'd love to have you talk a little about that.
I get this worry all the time and I understand it. It seems like there's sort of 2 different ways to go wrong here. One is to sort of fall into the what the reformers called works righteousness, where you're really just trying to become a better person yourself on your own. And it's all about your effort. And what about grace? Like, where's the grace in that story? That's not a Christian story. But then the other side, I think we can swing the pendulum back too far, where it's like, it's only grace. Yeah. I don't have to do anything. Like, I'm just going to keep on living my life as before. Well, wait a minute. What about change? How does change happen? Is there any agency or any intentionality or any contribution at all of mine? I mean, we think we should go to church. We think we should pray. We think we should do devotions. It's not like there isn't stuff for us to do, but how do we understand that in a way that doesn't swing us back into a kind of works righteousness paradigm? So the way I usually explain it to my students is what you need is a picture of sanctification. So this conversation begins after conversion. So you're justified by Christ alone. Good, done, awesome. Now what? You got the rest of your life to go, right? Presumably, spiritual growth is part of the program from here on out, right? You're on the team, you're in relationship with God, but what does relationship with God do to transform your life? That's the question of sanctification. How does the Holy Spirit work in us to change our character? Well, now that we're in a sanctification frame, it seems to me we can start talking about character. I don't want to talk about getting rid of vices as a way to get right with God. I think that's obviously missing the mark theologically. But what God wants in me is for me to become more and more Christ-like so that I can be closer to him. So communion with God, closer and closer communion with God is the goal. And sanctification is the language, the theological language that I use here. And I also like to just foreground the point that the pathway forward here, in my view, is spiritual discipline, not virtue practice. That was a game changer moment for me.
Okay. Yeah. How would you, I love that. How would, maybe for someone who's listening to this, how would you define spiritual discipline as different than virtue practice? Like what's the difference between those two?
Yeah. So here's the thing. There's a huge movement in American self-help literature today that is echoes a lot of positive psychology, but it's really about making yourself a better person and self-improvement and trying to be more grateful and do some gratitude practices. And it's stuff like that. And a lot of that language is just sort of American self-helpism. Like, you can do this, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, be a better person, etc. And there's a Christian version of that out there that I'm quite worried about, because I think it leaves no grace in the picture, or very little grace in the picture. The idea is I can do this sanctification work by myself. And that's just crazy. Also false. And if you try to do it, you'll probably be about as successful as you were with your New Year's resolution. So sooner or later, you're going to come back and say, hey, what's the different path here? And I think the different path is spiritual discipline. And I use a different name for it to signal just how different it is. The idea with spiritual disciplines is that you're intentionally engaging in practices of open-handedness to the Spirit's transforming work. So, for example, I'm not trying to be more patient. What I'm doing is practicing silence and solitude. It's a kind of open-handed receptivity posture of, Lord, I recognize that there's work that I need done in this area, and I'm laying it open to you, and I'm asking you, what do I need? What do I need to hear from you? What do I need to receive from you? When I lay my life before you, what are you prompting me to do or change or feel? And so it's more of an attunement, attention-giving, receptive posture to God than it is okay, I've got these 3 practices and I'm off to do them and I'm going to get result X if I practice them for the next 66 days. Like, it's just not that formulaic.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it definitely does. And I wonder, for someone that's intrigued but hasn't entered in much to a vices and virtue conversation, to bring back, whether again 7 deadly sins or the capital vices, is that almost like, would that be a good starting place in your mind for someone exploring this field, or exploring this moment in their life after they've been justified and are interested in this? Or is there a different kind of starting point? I'm struck by you being kind of overwhelmed in a positive way by reading Aquinas. Is that what we should kind of point people towards? It sounds like you take your students through that, but are the 7 deadly sins or capital vices, is that a good starting place for exploration in this space?
I think it can be if it's framed the right way. So Dante in his Purgatorio, there's another book you're probably not going to want to read on your own, but in his Purgatorio, it talks about naming the vices and moving forward as a kind of rehabilitative program. So the point of naming is to recover and rehabilitate. So as long as we're in that framework, I think the vices can be really helpful. But I want to forestall one really, really big misunderstanding, which is that the 7 deadly sins are like the worst 7 things that you could ever do, right?
Yeah, thank you. Talk more about this.
I usually tell people they're not 7, they're not deadly, and they're really not best called sins. So
let's do it. Let's go. That's perfect.
It's really a top 10 list. Okay, so there's no magic about 7 here, other than it fits neatly with other sets of 7s in catechetical training, but I'm not wedded to 7. You shouldn't be either. The tradition certainly wasn't. Early on, there were 8 or maybe 9. So the way that the desert Christians were thinking about this early on in the tradition was, we're going to go out in the desert. We're going to try to focus our lives really intentionally on Christ-likeness and try to allow God to transform us in all these different ways. And they just kept running across the same old garbage over and over and over again. And what they realized is this is perennial human stuff. These are the top 10 things every single one of us in the human race keeps stumbling over. The most common pitfalls there are substituting pleasure or comfort or power or fame or status or honor or reputation or self-provision. Like all these things are just sinful go-tos for us of things that we are trying to find happiness in without God. No, I don't need God. I can get pleasure for myself.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't need God. I can provide for myself. Oh, no, I don't need God. I can provide for my own self-worth if I just achieve enough stuff in the world.
Yeah.
Right. So we're on this constant sort of prideful self-help program. My goal, my picture of happiness, my power to get it. So that's the problem. So that's the way they're thinking about the sins. And the way that they're thinking about them then is that these aren't just one-off sinful moments. They're lifestyles. So my go-to is pleasure, or my go-to is seeking self-worth in other people's affirmation of me, or my go-to is to provide for myself and to be independent. And all these are pathways, which is why the habit language, the vice language fits. So it's not like, well, I committed the sin of gluttony this one time. Nobody cares. What we care about is when that becomes a groove in your life, when that becomes a pathway to happiness, because then it's going to bear all kinds of other fruit in your life, all kinds of other symptoms that are going to be characteristic of you, because this is your character. This is your life now. This is who you're becoming. So the worry for them was that these common pitfalls would be grooves in our life, ruts we wouldn't be able to get ourselves out of, because they would captivate us, promising ways to happiness without God or instead of God. So that was the worry, which is why they're called capital vices, not deadly sins. Deadly sounds like, I don't know, a mortal sin or something that's not even Protestant theology. So what you have to think about is capital vices just mean fountainheads or source vices. And they're sources because they're happiness substitutes. We're trying to do our own thing instead of listening to God. And honestly, that's Adam and Eve all over again.
Yeah.
Right? There's nothing new under the sun. That's the kind of takeaway here. So sometimes people are like, oh, these old sins. I'm like, no. These are as new as they've ever been. They're the same stuff we've been doing forever. They're as relevant for us as they were for people 2,500 years ago or even more.
Which is why you had such a connection with Aquinas and what he was writing about there.
Right.
So that's, really
right. So maybe the language is off-putting or requires some translation, which is why I'm trying to do that in the book. I don't know about you, but most people I know don't use the term vainglory anymore. But that isn't to say that what they're naming with that word isn't as absolutely relevant in the life of your average 13-year-old or 33-year-old or whatever as anything else.
Well, maybe say a little bit about, so you named Vainglory. What are maybe, I'd love to hear you describe that one a little bit because we mentioned it up top as well. Yeah. But then maybe even just what are some of the other 6, 7, 8 that are in this list of capital vices, and how do those kind of play out? So I'd love to hear about, you said we don't use the language of vainglory, but what is that and how does it show up in our lives?
Vainglory is one of my personal favorites because I'm a person who stands up in front of other people and talks for a living. So you, a pastor, I, a professor, we're on display. That's the name of the game. So vainglory is an ancient word that just means seeking glory or attention and affirmation from other people, recognition, in excessive and disordered ways. So that's presuming actually that there's a good way to get recognition, that human beings need affirmation from other people. We're social. We're built for communion with each other. That involves recognition, but the right kind of recognition versus disordered, excessive. I need it all. I'm going to get it all for myself, not receive it from God as a gift. I can manufacture it. I can do my personal brand. I can, do all my stuff on social media or whatever. Or I can just stand up in front of a classroom and try to sound smart, right? That's the professor version of this. I could just mention all the books that I've read that you guys have never heard of or whatever, throw the terminology around. Everybody knows the tricks of the trade, right? Because it's such a familiar vice. So there's lots of ways to be vainglorious, even though we don't use that term anymore. It's just excessively seeking attention. And honestly, you're like, oh, well, okay, I'm not the Kardashians, so I guess I'm in the clear maybe. But the truth is, Christians do this. Like the version of vainglory that the tradition is most worried about is Christian vainglory, like the kind Jesus talks about in Matthew 6. Like, don't be praying on the street corner, and don't be trying to out Christian and out respectable your neighbor, and then be morally grandstanding about it. Like, stop. That's the problem. You're doing it with your own Christian virtue. You're showing it off. That's the wrong kind of glory getting. That's the wrong kind of glory seeking. So that's one of the ones on the list that we've kind of forgotten the name of, but there are other ones. Gluttony is pretty familiar. Sloth, pretty familiar. Greed. Those are all very familiar. My students love to read the chapter on envy because they're at a stage of life where they have an insecure, typically not completely developed sense of self. And so that whole status seeking thing and being competitive about that, very much a part of their lives. And one that I think sounds familiar, but again, isn't, is sloth. That's really not about being lazy. It's about being unwilling to commit to all the difficult long-term transformation that God is calling you to. And that, boy, I got to that chapter and I thought, oh, thank goodness I don't have that one. I'm a super, super busy, super diligent person. And I started reading about sloth and thought, oh, I'm so sunk on this one too.
Wow. Yeah. As I've looked at this tradition, I've come to see that probably sloth is actually one of the ones that is one of my deepest ruts. This sort of laziness in love, or unwilling to pay attention to and give attention to the right things, to be busy with other things so I don't have to attend to what's most important, whether that's the human relationships that are in my life or the relationship with God. But yeah, as I began to, I similarly would have not said like, oh, I feel like I'm a lazy person who just sits around and watches Netflix. But as I started doing the work on that one, I was like, wow, okay, this kind of, attending to the wrong things, or being unwilling to commit, or seeking a comfort and a security that doesn't risk what commitment requires. It's like, oh man.
Do you think that's especially American one these days? I mean, we are a culture of instant comfort and convenience. We're all about efficiency and productivity, and the spiritual life is a slow grow. So I just feel like
that requires a lot of commitment.
Yes, a lot of long-term commitment with not a bunch of immediate payoff. So I feel like in terms of the way that our culture forms us, there's real resistance there too, I think. The kind of transformation that sloth blocks.
It's, to me, the subtitle of Eugene Peterson's classic work, Along Obedience, in the same direction, gets right at what you're saying. But he wrote that book, the first edition is 1980. So we're going back 44 years. And even then, his subtitle was Discipleship in an Instant Society. And just, sort of the prescient, like, look around the corner leader that saw what was coming, again, 44 years ago. And I would say, only ever more.
And if you wanted to watch a movie, you had to go to Blockbuster.
Right. Yes, that's right.
That was the day.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and likewise, his title, Eat This Book, the kind of idea that you're going to chew on things and savor them. Again, it's slow rather than the fast-paced society, food for fuel, vending machine kind of stuff that we want nowadays.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, I'm really intrigued by a sloth kind of being maybe a particular American vice in this moment. And it sort of even makes me think back to our conversation a little bit earlier about spiritual discipline. And I love the line from G.K. Chesterton where he talks about, Christianity hasn't been tried and found wanting. It's been found difficult and left untried.
Yes.
And I think there's a sloth kind of interrupts that. Wow, there's something really beautiful about this tradition, this way of Jesus. And yet, as I start into it, it's like, wow, this is going to take some effort. It's going to take some sacrifice. It's going to take, and we talk a lot at Christ Community too about, this is classic, Dallas Willard, but that grace is opposed to earning, but not opposed to effort.
Yes.
That grace and obedience are intimately interwoven, even though earning and grace are utterly opposed to one another. But that language from Chesterton seems like it points to that sloth problem as interrupting our discipleship.
Mm-hmm. I don't know that sloth is the only one that I would say is sort of on the forefront of my mind when I'm thinking about. I mean, I'm a U.S. citizen, so I'm thinking American culture specifically here. I mean, obviously, vainglory is a thing in the sense that our lives are all more public than they've ever been.
Yes.
And publicity is really hard on relationship. Like, it's very, very difficult to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, humiliation, shame is all sort of publicity just raises the stakes on all that stuff. And, if you're going to be a learner, in the spiritual life and a fumbling apprentice, as most of us are, you're going to have to be vulnerable, and you're going to have to let your flaws show, and you're going to have to make mistakes and admit them. And, if you're not in a safe place to do that, it's going to be really hard to get to the place where you're willing to be honest enough to grow. And so I do think publicity pulls us into kind of a little bit more putting on a mask, image management, hypocrisy mode. And, that's where the vainglory dynamic, I think, is really dangerous for us. And I think vainglory is as old as this tradition, but there's forms of it today and cultural forms that, make it a pressure point for us as well. But I also think that, and this is one of the more interesting things about my conversations about the book, is people rarely bring up greed. And I think it's because it's the air we breathe.
Yeah.
Like, you don't even think about it as a problem because it's just what you are. And we've so inhabited that space that we don't even feel the struggle anymore. Yeah. Which I think that's even probably more scary.
Yeah. How do you unpack greed? How would you define what greed is? How does it show up in our lives? Yeah.
I would think of it as excessive attachment to possessions and the feeling of being a possessor, being the master of my possessions. So that kind of feeling like I want to be self-sufficient. I want to be able to provide for myself and have the means to do that. And that's gonna give me a sense of security.
So in that sense, someone could be greedy that actually maybe even wouldn't have that many material possessions if they checked the box on the second half of how you were describing it, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yeah, no, and I think the having a lot of stuff, that's the trick with all of these. They're really heart problems. So the symptoms are just that, symptoms. So you might be a really busy person and not be slothful, or you might be a really busy person and be slothful. It would be a matter of the heart, right? And the same thing with possessions. You could have a lot or a little. It's really a question about how tightly you're holding them and why you're motivated to hold them so close. So what's the attachment story there? And if it's attachment to this stuff because it makes me feel secure, so I don't have to rely and depend on God, we're in trouble territory there.
Yeah.
And I think we're all in trouble.
Yeah, right. That's right.
I do.
Right.
I think of myself.
Yeah.
I actually went through a period in my life where I thought I was going to have to relinquish all my possessions and unpack my whole office and give all my stuff away. And it really made me think hard about if I actually had to hand this stuff over, how hard would that be? And why would it be hard? That's always the question that the desert Christians who began this tradition want to ask.
Yeah, it makes me think just this week, I was sitting down to do our family budget, and my wife was gone that evening. So I told the kids that they could go down and watch Bluey. So Paul loves Bluey.
I do love Bluey.
They could go down and watch a show so that I could have some kind of quiet focus spaces. And my 8-year-old says to me, Dad, whenever you do the budget, you get really cranky and you're not very patient with us.
So we'll be in the basement.
Yeah. And I had this moment where I was like, yeah, why is that? I kind of wanted to defend myself and say, well, money's stressful and it takes a lot of concentration. But I began thinking, but part of the reason that moment is always so stressful is I feel this, either the level of security or insecurity attached to how are the bills and the medical bills and the different, how is this coming together? And there's always this anticipation of sitting down to do that work and how's it all going to come out? And I don't want to look at it. And then I need to look at it. And it's not just that it takes concentration, it's that there's a certain attachment to what these numbers represent as far as my sense of security and hope. And it's like my kids look at it and just say like, well, yeah, Dad, it just makes you kind of grumpy.
Kids are so good at calling you out on vice.
On vice.
Right? I have 4 myself, and they're exceptionally adept at it. But I would say this, Tim Keller has this great line in Counterfeit Gods, where he says, look at your most negative, intense emotions, and then look at what's going on there. So when you're super angry, or you're despairing or desperate or whatever it is, contemptuous, like what's beneath that? What's behind that? It's often an excessive attachment of some kind, something that you're desperately afraid to give up, or something that you're cherishing too closely. And I have to say, I do think that, that's why the spiritual disciplines are the right answer to the vices, because the vices are holding on to stuff of our own, whereas the spiritual disciplines are just teaching you to open yourself up and surrender everything and be ready to receive whatever comes. I mean, I often tell my students, I've fasted any number of different ways, any number of different times, and something different happens every time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like I have gluttony, so then I fast, and that makes me temperate. I mean, I wish it were that simple. But the truth is, my fasting revealed a control issue, not a eating issue. So, like Richard Foster has that line, fasting reveals whatever controls us. So it's a detachment discipline, and it doesn't matter almost which form of detachment you're practicing. Yeah, it'll start excavating things, and they'll be uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, you kind of mentioned in naming temperance, there's a virtue. And so what role do virtues play in overcoming vices? Or maybe you wouldn't even use that framework or language. You'd say that, because you've mentioned in such beautiful ways the importance and centrality of spiritual disciplines to this whole process. So is a virtue sort of the end result, or what's at the end of the pathway of a properly practiced spiritual discipline? Or how would you sort of bring virtues back in, and how does cultivating them connect us more deeply to the story of God and His Word?
That's a great question, in part because people often want to do a matchup between this vice and this virtue. And I'm just curious, what is the virtue that goes with vainglory? I don't know. I'm kind of stumped by that one, honestly. I don't always, or maybe there's a vice with 3 virtues that might be on the other side of it. Anger, patience and gentleness, and who knows what, mercy. I don't know.
Yeah.
So it's trying to get a 1-to-1 might be a little messy, which, I mean, fine, life is messy. But my solution to that is to try to think about the virtues as articulating aspects of Christ-like character that might not even all be present in a given person, but might be collectively present in the body of Christ, which is why we are a community.
It's a beautiful thought. Yeah.
But that's the whole point, right? Why are we trying to become like Christ? So I can be a perfect person? Is that the goal? Because I think that's a mistake too. I think the whole point of becoming Christ-like is to be drawn into the life of the Trinity. It's communion and relationship. That's the goal. So to be perfect like Christ is to be perfectly in relationship to God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So I just think of this as the Spirit's kind of ushering us along toward Christ-likeness, and Christ is like, yes, see how I'm connected to the Father? Come on in. So that's the way I think about the process. And we are the kind of people who are both inspired and encouraged by role models we can copy. Yeah. And so when we see people with Christ-like character or Christ himself, we're like, hey, that's inspiring. I want to be like that. I mean, I know several really beautifully spiritually mature people that I want to be when I grow up. And they're a source of inspiration to me. And I guess it's humbling to think about how far I still have to go, but it gives me a very concrete picture of what I'm aspiring to. And that's really important. Even Aristotle says, look, when you're practicing the virtues, you need to articulate what they are so you know what you're aiming at.
Yeah, so maybe what we've talked about, so the capital vices, I know there's also this kind of language in the philosophical tradition of kind of cardinal virtues.
Yep.
And so we have certainly biblical language
Yep.
that we've talked about. You can look at the fruit of the Spirit or 2 Peter 1 and these other places where you get these kind of lists of virtues. But I wonder, could you maybe just articulate a few of those kind of capital or cardinal virtues on the other side that in that tradition, both of kind of philosophy broadly, but then the ways that Christians have kind of adapted that language?
Yeah, so the first four come from the Greek tradition, Plato and
Yep.
Aristotle. So you've got wisdom. Sometimes it's called practical wisdom. Then you got justice, courage, and temperance. And those are the big four. You're going to find them in Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and everybody. And then the Christians came along and they're like, hey, those sound pretty good, but let's add three more. What the three called the so-called theological virtues from 1 Corinthians 13, faith, hope, and love. And then everyone had to puzzle about how those two sets might be related. So you get 4 plus 3, that's 7, which is one reason to shave the vice list down to 7.
Right.
So you have
Right.
a series of sevens, right?
Yeah.
It works better in catechism class or whatever. Everyone can memorize it more easily. But the idea, I think the way that the Christian tradition wanted to think about it is there's some really distinctive Christian virtues that don't make that list of 7.
Mm-hmm.
Humility's not on it.
Yeah.
Right, that's Philippians 2. That's the
Yes,
heart
it
of
is.
when Christ describes his own character. He says, "I am meek and humble of heart." So gentleness and humility, they're not on that list. Neither is gratitude. And I'm like, that's got to be. If grace is the center of the Christian life, gratitude's got to be on the list of Christian virtues.
Yeah.
So it's a little messy when you try to think about, okay, what should be on this virtue list? If you're trying to pull in different traditions, it can get a little jumbled. Sort of, why are we putting temperance on this list and not gratitude? Well, I don't have a good answer for that. I think gratitude should be on it. So one of the things that you have to decide if you write a book on the virtues is, what's the table of contents going to be?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's fascinating. Well, and you sharing about a couple of people in your life, sort of exemplars of the faith that you aspire to. I wonder, I'm putting you on the spot with this question a little bit, but in their life, is there let's maybe focus in on one person, whoever you want, and is there one virtue and a story that kind of illustrates that virtue in their life that stands out to you? Or maybe just, if that's too hard of a question to put you on the spot for, I'm just struck by the power of that idea of an exemplar of the faith and what particular virtues have been impactful in your life.
I think what I always notice first is how at peace they are, and therefore how gentle they're able to be with others. And that is slow living, folks. You are not doing that in a hurry. You're not getting to that kind of character in a hurry, and that kind of character doesn't hurry. So there's a kind of, when you're at peace, you're not coming in with a lot of ego. You're not coming in with a lot of agenda. You're able to be attentive, and you're able to receive other people fully and to extend them a kind of graciousness that doesn't try to force them into a mold or get them to believe this or try to get something out of them. Just letting them be themselves and letting them bask and be embraced in the love of God. I think that's probably the signature thing. That's not just one thing. It's a cluster of things. But that's the best I can do to articulate. But I do feel like that's a theme across the people I know who have really matured in Christ-likeness.
Yeah, I love that. It reminds me, our lead senior pastor tells he had a couple different chances to get to know Dallas Willard over the years.
Yeah.
And he tells a story, I think from one of the first times he got to interact with Dallas, where somehow it came up. So I don't know if it was like a conference or somebody asked Dallas if they could describe Jesus in just one word. And his answer is unrushed.
Or relaxed.
Or relaxed.
Yeah,
That's it. Relaxed.
Yeah.
That was it. Relaxed. And so it reminds me of that. That's it. Relaxed. Yeah.
But it's not
so
like
beautiful.
Chilled out.
Yeah,
relaxed.
right.
It's like,
Exactly.
there's just so lack of ego there.
Yeah.
And also this kind of deep, abiding, strong trust in God to handle whatever happens.
Yeah.
Like whatever comes in the next half hour, I don't have to worry about it. I can be relaxed because God's clearly got this under control. He's clearly holding me in love. that means I can kind of let go of stuff.
Wow.
Yeah, like I said, it's aspirational.
Right. Yeah. No, I know. But it's also one, it when you see it.
Yes.
And
you do.
as you were describing that from, I'm assuming very real people in your life, I was immediately thinking of the very real people in my life that embody that and that have shaped me in that way. And so there's a real beauty to that answer.
Yeah. So then I contrast that with me in traffic or
right.
Christians on social media or political debate. It's like we have a long way to go on this one. And
we do.
I do think the beauty of this tradition is that it can both be so convicting, but not despairing. It can be so convicting in the sense that, look, you're being drawn towards something better here. There's something better that you can offer, and there's something better that you can receive. Just open your hands up.
It's wonderful.
Wow. Well, I wonder, we've talked about a number of different vices along the way in our culture. We talked about greed a little bit. We've talked about vainglory, sloth. Any other one that you think modern culture wrestles with this contemporary moment that we're in the United States, and how might the church respond to it?
Well, pride is the root of the tree in this tradition, but envy is a close second. So the way that Gregory the Great talks about envy is it's a competitive status vice. So when you think about vainglory, envy, and pride together, I like to call them the vices of self-regard, because they're vices that have to do with the self, its groundedness, its worth, its status. And I think if you're trying to build that for yourself, then it's all about how do I outrank or outachieve the competition. And then I need affirmation to make sure that I am in fact doing that. So that's the vainglory piece. Like I have to let people know that I have this status, because otherwise what good is it going to do me? And then also I have to downgrade other people who are threatening my status. And that's the envy piece. It's the undermining of other people or the resenting of people who outdo you. So I do think there's a kind of insecurity about the self, a kind of conditional love that we inhabit sort of naturally as a fallen people. And also in this kind of competitive environment where you get to make yourself or be a self-made person. I think there's a big mess there that a lot of us are embroiled in at a pretty deep level. I struggle with that in my career. And so, I think of my career as a vocation. Like I'm not just trying to be a smart professor here and publish a lot of books. I'm trying to change lives. And I think God has called me to this, whatever. But man, the entanglement there is so easy in terms of how am I stacking up against other people who are also in this profession? And is my name well known? And am I known as this kind of philosopher or this kind of professor, or, and are other people outdoing me and making me look bad? And what if I get on the Formed Life podcast and blow it? Is that going to completely wreck my reputation? I'm being facetious, but you get idea.
Yeah.
I think Americans are in a very hyper-competitive culture. So we've kind of taken the market economy and made it the market of how we market ourselves and think about ourselves. And that's just become part of the way that we inhabit life. And it's so bad for communion. It's so bad for loving people. And that I think I would describe it as a hidden danger, because I don't think we articulate that necessarily. We're like, oh, power, that's bad. And greed, that's bad. We all recognize that. But the ways that it kind of seeps into our own lives, and even the way we think about, I'm going to send a Christmas card out soon. I don't know if you guys are, but when you get those Christmas cards and you have the perfect family Christmas cards and you're like, oh man, I'm even doing it with my Christmas card. That's terrible. But that just is a symptom, I guess, of the ways in which it can sort of subtly get into our hearts and lives and just everyday practice.
I'm intrigued by that, kind of those three together of pride and vainglory and envy. And I wonder if, just as you were talking, the thought came to mind that the role that sort of a mindset of scarcity plays, in particular maybe in envy, that if there seems like there's also this element of the competition, because there's only so much love or affirmation to go around. And so if I'm getting someone else isn't getting it, or if they're getting it, it means I'm not getting it. Mm-hmm. And this sort of deep sense of I'm not loved, there's not enough, as opposed to a kingdom kind of framework of abundance, there's more than enough. And I think, going back to even, doing the budget, that's the scarcity mindset in those spaces is like, there's not enough to go around. There's not going to be enough, but we live in this kingdom of abundance that Jesus has invited us to, in the ways that, I don't know, just that mindset of scarcity. I think maybe that's part of the marketing culture in which we live, is there's stuff you don't have that you need. You better get this thing that feeds into that envy, but taps into this sense of I'm unlovable, or I need this affirmation.
Yeah. I mean, for being the grace alone people, right? I just feel like at a really deep level, we don't believe it. Not living out of an abundant mindset. And also just not understanding ourselves as unconditionally loved. There's, not a lot of human relationships that have that kind of depth to them, where you really, really are secure in another's unconditional love. So it can be hard to imagine what that would even be like. I mean, I sometimes call it fairy tale Christianity. We're offering you the fairy tale that you can be unconditionally loved, and everyone who's lived in this world for any amount of time is like, yeah, no, that's a fairy tale. Who does that? That's a fantasy. But it isn't a fantasy. It's actually the most real thing about us, that we are unconditionally loved. And it's like, wow, if I could really live into that, I'd be washing my hands of a lot more of this vicious kind of excessive grasping, and doing a lot more just rejoicing, delighting in things.
Well, that's beautiful. Any other resources, or obviously we'll link to your wonderful books in our show notes, but anything else that you feel like is a particularly impactful resource to pass along to our listeners, for those that were intrigued by today's conversation?
I have two, actually, and they're ones that I've benefited from and have also been involved with. One is the spiritual formation organization called Renovare. Yeah. And they have a website. And then there's another website that's set up to devoted to curate basically the legacy of Dallas Willard and his teaching resources, conversatio.org. And that's another treasure trove of spiritual formation, insight, resources, wonderful stuff there. Wonderful. So I would highly recommend both of those.
We'll link to both of those in the notes. Yeah. Do you want to ask our final question?
Sure. Well, we always ask our guests a final question.
Get to know you.
Yeah, kind of a get to know you question. We never know the answer beforehand, so it's always fun for us.
I don't think we've ever gotten the same answer from different guests.
Yeah, that's true. That is if you could just live a whole other life, you're doing this amazing work as a professor and a writer, but if you just had the chance to just do something completely, totally different. And we had someone ask the other day, does this mean I can have skills I don't currently have? Absolutely. This is total wide open.
That's a game changer, though.
It doesn't have to be in your current skill set. Just you think it would be amazing. What career or job would you do? I always say I'd love to be a park ranger.
National Parks Ranger is Bill's answer.
Or a research librarian. I think it'd be really fun. But what would you do, Dr.
Well, before I knew I could have new and exciting skills, my answer is going to be anything with books, because I don't think I could live without being able to read more and learn more. I'm just like a lifelong learner person. So whether I did that professionally or not, I think I would have to have a library involved in some way. Yeah. But if I could have any skill I wanted, I think probably some of the most life-giving experiences I've ever have been taking long hikes completely off the grid in Glacier National Park. And so if I could hang out there full time, I think I would be in a very happy place. And I would happily leave my phone behind as well.
Yeah. Glacier National Park is one of my favorite places in the whole world. Truly, I've only spent 1 week there. I want to spend many more weeks there.
So I think her answers were your answers.
Yeah.
Research librarian and National Park Ranger. It's like we had it written down for me to ask this question, but mine would have been sports broadcasting.
Yeah, so that's what I was expecting, is the sports broadcasting thing.
I know. I'm really glad that we switched it up and Bill asked the question. So that was a fun connection. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for taking the time to join with us. This was really, really impactful, and we're so grateful for your generosity and sharing with us today. So thank you.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Look forward to joining the rest of you on a next episode of the theFormed.life podcast.